FEMA's funding foot FEMA's funding footprint in Appalachia. In total, FEMA provides a lot of support to the region, specifically 5.9 billion in grants to Ohio, Kentucky, West Virginia, and Pennsylvania. On the left here, we see a total breakdown of the FEMA grant dollar obligations, and on the right here, we see a heat map of these disasters. And we see some small counties, especially in Kentucky and West Virginia, are just hit rapidly by these storms, seeing between 11 to 16 disasters between 2014 and 2024 alone in just one county. With such a large amount of flooding disasters, these dollars are a vital lifeline for the area. And this analysis by the Pew Charitable Trust really drives this point home. They compared the highest aid years, so the most spending in one year over time from 2003 to 2025, with the reserve balance in 2024. And they found that for some states, the worst year in context was a large portion of their reserve balance. For West Virginia, that would have been 24.2% of their reserve balance. And so repeated natural disasters like the ones that we're seeing now would quickly deplete state budgets without any aid. And so this support is essential to ensure state budget solvency against escalating threats. However, as floods become more frequent and severe, and this money is essential, we haven't seen the money continue to increase. In fact, we've seen a sharp decrease since 2024. And this is the result of intentional downscaling of the agency's footprint, which ultimately leaves communities more vulnerable to disasters. Now, this downscaling hasn't occurred in the vacuum. In fact, it's coincided with many other changes in the agency in 2025 also. An overview of how these changes emerged. As we know, on day one of the Trump administration, he implemented the Department of Government Efficiency through executive order to initiate his federal downsizing agenda. And despite FEMA's critical importance, this has also touched FEMA as well. And this administration intended to drastically change the agency structure, and this was clearly communicated by the administration itself. This wasn't something that we just implied or extrapolated. And so what this looks like overall is attempts to terminate vital grant programs like the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities program, efforts to claw back already obligated pre-disaster mitigation funds, and the creation of new barriers to accessing federal support. So here in our report, we identified 26 main points. And here in this presentation, I'm only going to highlight a couple. And I picked different ones that I think shows different portions of what different types of changes looked like. So starting off again, in January, the Trump administration started with Executive Order 14180 to convene a council to assess FEMA. This is called the FEMA Review Council. Again, really starting and signaling an intention to drastically change the agency structure. In March, FEMA stopped enforcing the federal flood risk management standard policy. This policy was enacted to promote flood resiliency standards in federally supported projects. So by not enforcing this standard, this increases vulnerability to future disasters. On April 4th, the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities program, FEMA announced that it was terminated, aiming to rescind 882 million in pre-disaster mitigation funding, many of which was already awarded and promised to projects. In June 18th, Secretary Noem, at the time, required personal review of all contracts over $100,000, slowing down disaster response times. And we'll talk more about in the next slide what that looked like in an actual disaster context. On October 1st, we saw the longest shutdown in United States history, and in FEMA specifically, 3,950 employees were furloughed, and many programs that supported flood resiliency, like the National Flood Insurance Program, were lapsed in the meantime. And then on December 11th, we do see a backlash against this, as a federal judge reversed the BRIC termination, ordering the release of funds. But it wasn't until a couple of months later that there was an enforcement ruling and the money is actually being released. So what do these changes mean? What do all of those timeline points amount to? Well, for one, we see a delay in disaster responses. As I talked about on the last slide, Secretary Noem started a new role requiring her personal review, her signature on contracts over $100,000 in the Department of Homeland Security. There's a lot of contracts over this amount. And so in 2025, Texas saw historic levels of flooding with claiming 137 deaths. But while this was going all on, call center contracts expired, and these call centers serve as a critical connection point between communities and FEMA resources. Ultimately, because they were not automatically renewed because of her new role, call center contracts sat for 5 days awaiting approval, leaving survivors stranded and unable to access the FEMA helpline. And in fact, on the worst days, only 15.9% of helpline calls were answered. This delay in response is also reflects in other metrics that occur in the Trump administration. One metric that is used is the days that it takes between a state or tribal leader's request for disaster support and the day that the president either approves or denies the support. The Biden administration took an average of 32.2 days, whereas the Trump administration has seen a 79% increase in waiting time for support. This is amounted to 57.6 days. And then this graph here on the right shows that this has also not been felt equally between states based on their political leanings. Trump, on average, has taken 80 days to act on disaster requests from Democratic-led states compared to an average of 40 for Republican-led states. And this disparity in politicization is not only in the delays and the amount of time it takes, it's also simply whether a community or state receives the disaster declaration and disaster support. Democratic-led states, he approved only 23% of disaster requests, whereas he approved 89% of Republican-led disaster requests. Between the Reagan and Biden administration, we haven't seen such a large disparity, and it wasn't only until the Trump administration we see it now that this is almost 4 times the approval rate for Republican-led states compared to Democratic-led states. And ultimately, what this amounts to is $250 million denied to communities, denied to everyday people that could help them in their worst days of suffering. Other changes that we identified is, as we talked about with DOGE, there's been workforce instability within the federal agency. Between January and June 2025, FEMA lost 9.5% of their active employees. This includes 24 senior executives, and they also saw 3 different acting directors. This is ultimately a massive loss of institutional knowledge of experienced workers who know how to best coordinate responses on the ground. And then we see this is already building operational strains. In June 2025, 710 open major disasters existed, but only 12% of the incident management workforce was available for hurricane response because remaining staff were managing disasters elsewhere. Again, this just strains the ability for coordination of resources on the ground from these active employees. And then our final impact that we saw was lengthy legal battles. In total, there were 359 lawsuits filed against the Trump administration, not just in FEMA, but overall. And lawsuits take months to resolve. As we talked about with BRIC, the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities program, it was initially terminated on April 4th, 2025. It wasn't until July that 20 states filed a lawsuit to block this cancellation. And then months later, in December, we saw a lawsuit rolling. And it wasn't until March 6, 2026, that an enforcement ruling was granted requiring FEMA to open new grant applications within 21 days. This is ultimately over a year of wait time where damage occurs as funding is paused or projects are canceled, and communities are left in uncertainty as how all of this will play out and what it means for them. And so finally, we're going to talk more about the BRIC program and give more specific examples of how all of these changes really impact one specific program and the projects in our communities. So what is BRIC? The Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities program provides pre-disaster mitigation support. So this is support before a disaster occurs to strengthen local infrastructure in hopes of reducing the damages in the future. And this is particularly cost effective. According to the Congressional Research Service, for every $1 invested by federal grant programs, society as a whole is expected to save $6 due to reduced future losses. Some awarded project examples are in Pennsylvania, a levee system upgrade, in Rand, West Virginia, sewage system upgrades. Frankfort, Kentucky saw hazard mitigation planning, and there was a Mineral Ridge Dam upgrade in Ohio. Again, these are just vital programs and projects that help every community survive disasters in the future. But with the termination, again, we're already seeing some roadblocks as the West Virginia and Pennsylvania projects have not yet received their selected funding. The March ruling should ensure that they receive their awarded grant money, but still there's some uncertainty as processing timelines remain unclear. So looking at BRIC as a whole, BRIC obligated a total of 94.9 million to the four-state region, with Ohio receiving 51.9 million, Pennsylvania receiving 40.4, Kentucky 2.1, and West Virginia half a million at in obligations specifically. And in fact, Kentucky and West Virginia have some of has received the lowest obligations across the nation. And a lot of this disparity has to do with the low capacity counties struggling to navigate the complex application processes that can take over a year. In 2024, high capacity counties received 19 times more funding than low capacity areas. So again, there are some barriers, but this is cost effective and does help communities overall with some necessary projects. And despite its cost effectiveness and its support, it's still not enough. In total, BRIC obligated 94.9 million to the region, but there were a total of $809.2 million requested in applications. This is obviously a significant shortfall, with only 11.7% of regional funding demand met. Our region needs more funding, not less. Demand was already unmet even before this termination in 2025. And again, the growing climate risks necessitate proactive and sustained pre-disaster mitigation funding. But what we saw was the termination, so ultimately funding cuts. And by attempting to claw back previously obligated funds, the administration destabilized an already strained landscape. So what does this look like in one specific community? One story is in Duryea, Pennsylvania. They're located on the banks of the Lackawanna River, so they see excessive flood risk. In the last 3 years, they've seen millions of dollars in property damage. What they need to protect their town of only 5,000 residents is to lift their levee by 3 feet, but this would cost $11 million, so nearly 3 times the town's entire budget. Prior to the BRIC termination, the community saw that BRIC could help them do this project that they could not do on their own. The community invested hundreds of thousands in design work in hopes of doing this complex application project, but the termination meant that the town could not complete the application. So, overall, because of the termination, projects were stalled for a full year following enforcement rulings with no clear timeline for a fund release. And these delays have left communities vulnerable as floods continue to happen and these ongoing events continue to wreak damage on our communities. So, in conclusion, FEMA provides essential support to Appalachia, but the support has decreased under the Trump administration. These funding decreases occur during a time of rapid changes in the federal government and in FEMA in particular. Policy shifts in 2025 led to the delay of aid, increased politicization, workforce instability, and long legal challenges. The BRIC program serves as a case study for how these changes harmed Appalachian communities. And ultimately, to build a truly flood resilient region, Appalachia requires robust, stable, and transparent federal investment. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anna. That was so much fantastically organized information. I see the claps in the chat. Absolutely wonderful. I think so that presentation, again, those recordings will be sent out to folks who join because I know that was a lot of information, but absolutely wonderful work. It's been great to have you, by the way, as an intern this last season. So now we're going to move from that really big piece and, like Anna did at the end of the presentation, kind of look more closely at, a region that is seeing these issues again and again and hear from Les a little bit about, what it means on the ground, what the work looks like on the ground, and what, what some of y'all's goals are for the long-term disaster resilience for Eastern Kentucky.
Yeah, thank you all for having me. As Dana said, I'm Les Rawls, Special Projects Manager with Mountain Association. We are a CDFI celebrating our 50th anniversary this year. So we've been around doing stuff for quite some time. I work in our Strategic Initiatives program. And in that program and that work, we do place-based capacity building and community development. So we partner with communities or groups within communities who are working on something or have a need or an opportunity, and help them then innovate and figure out how to move forward with that. Um, as sort of what you saw on the last slide, Kentucky and West Virginia falling in the bottom 10%, or so low in the nation for brick funding obligation. I mean, it's pretty reasonable. It's pretty obvious to look at that and think, under-resourced communities that are already starting behind the eight ball, are not going to be able to access these funds as quickly because they lack the capacity to do that and the resources to apply for those things. And I think that's really what we see on the ground. Is in a lot of the communities we work in, they're very small communities. There's 12 of us and we're all doing the same thing, right? Like, or we're all doing different things at the same time, rather, is what I mean. The majority of our communities are, they lack the tax base to support multiple government positions or multiple municipal resources to navigate these systems, to fill out these applications, to gather this information. And the vast majority of the communities, unfortunately, that we're in are also working in recovery mode from the last disaster. We're seeing them, they're trying to fix the things that happened the last time, answer those questions, solve those problems, and then simultaneously trying to access the resources to figure out what comes next, and how do we make the next disaster not quite as bad. We have recently engaged with Floyd County, Kentucky. That's about 35,000 people, 5 incorporated cities, and about 40 unincorporated community areas in that community. And they had been in touch with us. They brought us in to help them with a process to do some planning around a disaster resilience hub center. And I bring that up to say that they actually started that as a brick fund, or brick grant request. That their community had been approached by Kentucky Emergency Management and with the opportunity, and they spent about a year putting things together to apply for those funds and to do this project in a way that was going to allow them to sort of continue that, especially considering some substantial flooding they've had in their Beaver Creek area. And then right as they were submitting that final proposal, or that final last little bit of information, the BRIC program terminated. And so there they were left. There's a lady there in Floyd County, works for the Floyd Fiscal Court, the county government. And she is the person who does everything. In the last disaster, she's, if you can envision an old time switchboard, like she's the one there with people coming in and out and issues happening and popping around. And she's connecting workers to the local government to the volunteer groups to the folks that in churches and other community centers in these smaller areas. And as she is working on these things, she's talked to us and she said, listen, I'm doing all of these things and trying to get all this paperwork together and gather all of these things, this information that we need in order to start talking about how do we make this easier next time? How do we make this better for us in our community? And we spent a lot of time and a lot of political will locally, both with local government, but also with local folks as you're gathering information. And we invested all that, and then suddenly it was gone. And we've got this great plan, we've got this idea, and we put all this work into it, and now we just sort of wait in hopes that it comes back. And so they have engaged us, and we're working with them they've broken this out now into several different pieces and are sort of taking a different tack. But it's kind of like, instead of getting a big boat, you've got a couple of rowboats to try and get in the same direction, right? And so we're helping them identify, sites that would work for disaster resilience, what might be involved in that, and basically help them generate a grant-ready plan that they can then take for funding or for whatever purpose. But it is significantly scaled back from what they would like to do, and is not as targeted or as infrastructure heavy as they were hoping to do and to work on. And I heard from my friend and colleague in that community, who's the one sort of putting all that together, and she said that they had gotten notice that, that has picked back up. They now have the opportunity to reapply again, and they're working on that, but they're frankly gun shy. They've had this opportunity. They've expended all of this political will. It's election season. Um, and in contested local elections, when you've got folks who say, listen, you said you were going to do this for me. You took all this information, you said you were going to help me, and now you didn't. Not everybody understands, that's not necessarily in your control. You've got folks that say, well, you said you were going to do this for this community before. I assume you did it because I don't actually know. But now you say you're going to do it again. And why does their community get all this help and not my neighborhood or my community or my area of town? And that creates local officials that are, that are taking hits for things that are not their fault or otherwise trying to navigate these things and get this stuff through. Um, it is interesting to see. I will say that none of our communities are overly blessed with um, a lot of time to get things done. Frankly, we have arguably less time, whatever. Getting that wrong. Anyway, that's mostly what I've got. Dana, I'm happy to answer questions or talk more about that project or those things as we go.
That's fantastic perspective. And one of the things that, you, so Kevin is going to talk a little bit more about this next and but you see the Trump administration and the current maybe political movement towards saying that states and local governments need to be more responsible for disaster management. And it's not a lack of interest in the responsibility, it's a lack of capacity. You can't, disaster is a national problem that requires national level solutions. And so, one special shout out to Missy. I love that. And I want to say a shout out to all the sort of folks across our communities because I think so many counties are lucky to have a really special person in their local government that is making so much of this possible. So, feel free to, if other people want to celebrate their local beloved queen of making sure things happen. It's such a wonderful thing to see in the chat. Um, but yeah, with that, I'll hand it over to Kevin. Where are we now with some of the things that Anna reported on and what's next?
Sure. Thanks, Dana. Hi, everybody. My name is Kevin Zidak. I'm a government affairs specialist with Appalachian Voices. App Voices is a regional nonprofit organization that envisions an Appalachia with healthy ecosystems and resilient local economies that allow communities to thrive. So in our portfolio of work that for a long time in the existence of our organization has relied on economic development in former coalfield communities, supporting work in the Tennessee Valley Authority region, in supporting residents there, in engaging with the largest federal-owned utility, and kind of focusing on that environmental economic nexus. And we are a locally based organization with offices in Boone, North Carolina, Knoxville, Tennessee, Norton, Virginia, Charlottesville, Virginia, and most recently Charleston, West Virginia. And I say all of that to say we are a locally based organization that has folks out in the field working with local communities on developing projects. And one of the things that just kept coming up again and again was the need for improved disaster resilience policies, and folks saying, it's really hard to recover from the last disaster when we're being hit with another disaster, and we're these low capacity communities that have part-time or just volunteer local government officials, and this is just really difficult for us to manage. So over the past few years, as those events have continued, Appalachian Voices has gotten more involved in the flood resilience policy space. And my job here, being based in DC, is to translate that to lawmakers. So, Dana, can we get the slides?
Yes. Give me a second. I was sorry, I was reading the chat.
All right, so we can go to new DHS leadership. We'll start kind of like the most recent activity and work our way backwards. So the highest profile change this week in the world of FEMA is we do have a nomination for a Senate-approved FEMA administrator. This is the first of the second Trump administration. The president has nominated Cameron Hamilton, who folks might remember was the first acting FEMA administrator for the administration, and was dismissed after stating in a congressional hearing that he viewed FEMA to have an essential role in federal disaster management and recovery in the United States. So he has been nominated. Zooming out a little bit, we also have a new secretary of the Department of Homeland Security. Former Oklahoma Senator Markwayne Mullin was sworn in March, which now somehow is 2 months ago. And he has been very busy making a lot of changes. Anastasia mentioned in the report about Secretary Noem's policy on costs over $100,000. That policy has been rescinded by Secretary Mullin. Former FEMA employees have been brought back to the agency. Specifically the folks who publicly criticized disaster preparedness in August. There were some contract extensions for FEMA's term limited disaster workers. So really, Secretary Mullen has brought a new vision to FEMA in his leadership and is trying to get disaster aid out faster. That is going to come with a Senate-confirmed administrator. But it is worth noting here that DHS continues to withhold fire prevention money from some Democratic-led states. I will also say here, based on the report, we do have a really recent update that the courts have struck down the Trump administration's efforts to leverage FEMA funding for immigration enforcement activities. That is a new update this week. So that will be interesting to see how the administration reacts to the court rulings on that and getting that funding out. Going to just last week, lots of things happened in the past 2 weeks. We finally received the long-awaited FEMA Review Council report. FEMA Review Council was ordered in January of last year, expected the report in December. That meeting got surprisingly canceled, and we now have the report as of last week. Again, another initiative under Secretary Mullen was to get this report out and finalized. So it is important to say that the report does not carry legal weight. It is suggestions from the administration or from this review council to the administration on how to improve FEMA's programs. There's actually a chart. If you open the report and read through it, there's a chart that defines what would be achievable through agency policy, through executive regulations, through executive order, and through formal congressional legislation. So you can kind of see how all of that could be teased out. High-level changes proposed in the report here. Again, we've been saying it on the webinar a few times, this focus on shifting the financial and bureaucratic burden from the federal level down to states and locals. There's a proposed push for moving the National Flood Insurance Program more into the private insurance market, raising the threshold for an event to qualify for federal disaster assistance. This is kind of a contentious issue because that level has not been adjusted in quite some time. So there's an argument about, if you adjust it for inflation, that puts more of the burden back on states. But we know that can come with poor outcomes in more rural states that are struggling to manage those costs. There are proposed changes to individual assistance that would limit housing support, medical costs, funeral expenses, and other costs. One of the huge changes proposed there is on eligibility being contingent on someone's home being entirely uninhabitable, which is a pretty tough metric to hit and really concerning for the cost of recovery. If your house isn't completely uninhabitable, there's still going to be a lot of repairs that you need to do. Notably here, it does not include the 50% staff reduction at FEMA as previous leaked reports had suggested it might. Again, that is a sign of Secretary Mullen's leadership in this space on maintaining a federal presence and a federal agency that is capable of doing these programs, but figuring out how to navigate this and shift the responsibility down locally. Next slide. There we go. So getting back to BRIC, uh, the program was paused last year on March 6th. Judge ordered FEMA to reverse the terminations. By the end of March, FEMA had released a notice of funding opportunities for fiscal year 2024 and 2025, really shifting the focus, eliminating technical assistance from the available use of funds, and really focused on shovel-ready hazard mitigation projects. No more planning, no more design elements of projects. If you have a project that is ready to be built, that is what the focus of this new BRIC form is. So supposedly, FEMA was supposed to immediately provide previously canceled funds to states. As we've already discussed, there are still some awards out there that haven't actually been processed. And the new NOFO makes $1 billion available for new project submissions with a deadline of July. And that link, thank you, Liam, is in the chat. I will just add briefly that we worked with a community in Southwest Virginia that was highlighted in the report that had their BRIC technical assistance award rescinded, and the rescission of BRIC funding. Technical assistance in its old form was not a financial award. It was resources that folks from FEMA came down to Southwest Virginia, did tours of the community, understood where their challenges are in addressing flooding, was putting together data on elevation, and just really putting together a lot of resources the community themselves didn't have capacity to pursue and organize and fund. Unfortunately, those resources were also held up in the rescission of BRIC awards and have not been dispersed in this new era of shovel-ready projects. That technical assistance has not been provided. Next slide. Okay, so briefly here, want to talk about a few pieces of legislation in Congress that relate to FEMA reform. I will actually start at the bottom and work my way up, just on level of detail. So Farm Bill passed, the House passed their version of the Farm Bill, and it includes pretty substantial support for USDA conservation programs that support flood mitigation. The Appalachian Flood Resilience Coalition submitted a letter of support for those provisions to the Senate, where the House version is now going, while stressing that there are still issues with the House version of the Farm Bill that we would like to see addressed, but please keep these good conservation provisions included. Moving up to the CLEAR Act, the Championing Local Efforts to Advance Resilience Act. The purpose of this bill is to support states in establishing a state resilience authority, whether that's a state resilience officer or some other entity within the state, to organize across agencies and deploy resources for a statewide vision of resilience. Have to give a shout out on this bill for being co-sponsored by Representative Carol Miller from Southern West Virginia. West Virginia is one of the only states in the country with a designated chief resilience officer. And really excited to see West Virginia leading on getting more states across our region: Kentucky, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Tennessee, North Carolina also has an SRO. So just that handful of states, getting them up to capacity on resilience planning. The Road to Housing Act. This, an update as of today, the has been negotiated for a while between the Senate and the House. The Senate, in their version, included authorization of the Community Development Block Grant for disaster recovery, permanent authorization so that it could be administered like any other grant program and didn't have to rely on this like ongoing shaky situation with supplemental appropriations during disasters. Unfortunately, today we got text from the House of what their proposal after the Senate passed the bill, and it does not include permanent authorization for the CDBG-DR program, um, which is a setback. It is a pillar of our flood policy platform to give that certainty to communities, that planning capacity to communities to know that that is going to be something available and make it more easily available. The average of time that it takes CDBG-DR funds to be distributed is 318 days after a disaster on average. For folks doing the quick math, that is almost an entire year. And permanent authorization would really speed that timeline along. So it's not included in the Road to Housing Act or the 21st Century Housing Act, but we will continue pushing on that. And finally, the FEMA Act. This represents one of the most robust attempts at FEMA reform that we've seen recently. It would do a lot of things. I won't go into all of it, but really quickly makes a single application for disaster assistance for individuals, changes public assistance to be a per project grant, not this lengthy reimbursement process, has a shot clock on how long the agency can take to administer those funds. So if a community submits their cost estimate project development with an engineer certification, they only have, I think it's 120 days to get that money out. So it would be much faster than the current system, while also giving more specific funding than the FEMA Review Council report suggests. It does a lot of other stuff. It includes prioritization for rural and economically distressed communities, which we really like. We know that for rural areas, sometimes meeting that threshold of a federal disaster declaration can be difficult, but this directs the agency to specifically consider those factors when determining a disaster declaration. This bill passed out of committee last September. We are continuing to push on it. There is some writing of a Senate bill happening at the moment, though the FEMA Act has not passed the full House. We're not sure when that is going to get a vote. So we are continuing to push on that to really make significant progress on changing these FEMA programs. I will just quickly say, Rebecca, to your question, I don't believe so, but that is worth double checking. And that's all I've got. So Dana, back to you to lead us through Q&A here.
You're on mute. Dana, you're on mute.
Thank you. This is my first time on Zoom. See, that's my joke. Okay. So, yeah, I think we addressed a lot of our questions in the chat. If I miss any, please bump them up again. Just double checking. There's a great question from Ryan about the issue with brick applications, sort of being disadvantaged if your state has out-of-date building codes, and a great answer from Cheyenne. That does seem to be the case. If anybody has any more insight into that question, our report didn't look into specifically why brick applications weren't being successful. We just looked at the larger trends of where they were, where the money was actually going. So that's a fantastic line of inquiry to be digging into. And then Anna, I know you answered a question in the chat about the low and high capacity communities. I don't know if you want to say a little bit about that, sort of outside of the chat, just on camera, about what you found in
Yeah.
that. Yeah.
So the question was, what is the difference between low and high capacity communities? This information I gathered from an interesting report from Headwater Economics, and they created their own indicator variable, their own categorization based on local government staff and expertise, institutional capacity, economic opportunity, and engagement in education. And I also linked in the comment how the methodology that they use to define those communities, but I can send that down again.
Great. Thank you so much for that, Anna. Any other questions for our folks? We may have overwhelmed you with too much information. Yeah, go ahead, Janet. Yeah, and folks.
Yeah, yeah. So
Go ahead.
I'm not totally clear on this. Is more a comment than a question. So I'm not sure that West Virginia has any funding, state funding for their Office of Resilience yet, but they did in 2026. Justice Governor then Justice Governor Justice requested $50 million for flood resilience, and they did in 2026 approve 25 million for the state for the Flood Resiliency Trust Fund. But I'm not sure that the actual West Virginia State Office of Resilience has any funding itself, unless that's tied into it. I have no idea, but just wanted to throw that out there.
Thank you. Kevin?
Sure.
Yeah, I can. My understanding is they have administration funding, so the office can exist and it can operate as a kind of technical assistance trying to coordinate across the state, but it does not itself have grant-making funding available. So
Right.
the Flood Trust Fund is supposed to be that entity for the CRO to have responsibility for, ability to distribute that funding.
Great. And we have so many fantastic experts on the call. So thanks to Lynn and Rebecca for adding some numbers in the chat. And if y'all have any particular information you want to hop off mute and share with us, you're welcome to do that. One thing I love about our webinars is how many fantastic experts join us. So definitely want to hear that if it is there. Is there an expectation that the upcoming round of BRIC applications will exceed the $1 billion that's currently available? Or, are there thoughts about the uncertainty regarding the only having a 2-month application window, and the impact on applications that will come? I certainly have some feelings about that are more vibes than facts. But Kevin, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, or again, if anyone in the audience has any expertise into answering that question as well.
I think we probably have the same vibes, Dana, that I highly expect the application values to exceed the $1 billion. It is a program that has time and again been oversubscribed. The window is short, but there are also communities that have had projects kind of in the works building toward an application that have just been sitting there waiting to be able to apply since the NOFO didn't go out last year. So we're looking at 2 years for a program that at times was getting like $5 billion in applications. So I would say yes. Now, granted, we're removing planning costs, we're removing design costs, but I would still expect that to be over $1 billion.
And just to lift up what Les said as well about folks being gun shy to apply again or to try again as well. And so, though I imagine it will exceed costs, and this is more vibes and studied facts, but I suspect there are places that will be intimidated or frustrated out of applying because they have limited capacity and they have to kind of pick which, decide whether the juice is worth the squeeze when you have only so many resources. There also is probably some tough calls that will be made. So a question from Andrew Joyner, and it's okay if our speakers don't have the answer to this, because like I said, we didn't get super deep into the BRIC analysis, but does the state allocation allow for more flexibility regarding planning and capacity building compared to the national competition or the applications through the national competition need to be construction focused and shovel ready. I'm not sure that we have the answer to that with our current speakers, and I don't want to answer you wrong. I will say we have, if Kevin, if you do know the answer, that you're welcome to come off mute. We have some partners, and I know Liam dropped some of those links in the chat, and I have them that are doing technical assistance on the brick application. So if you're looking at creating a brick application and that kind of question is pertinent to that application, I would go to one of those technical assistance partners and make sure you're getting the best answer. But if anyone on the call has the answer, let us know. And great. Yeah, so Lynn, thanks for that thread on the State Resilience Office information. Great. And I'm just checking up on comments. And yeah, so Ryan, you're welcome to share that answer off mute as well. So the new BRIC guidelines are different than previous BRIC guidelines, Ryan. So we can say that. And my understanding is the new BRIC guidelines are stricter on the planning. Yes. So the Flood Coalition link that was just dropped in the chat was created by one of our partners to kind of for folks who've applied to this in the past, you can get a quick one-page overview of the things that you can expect to be different about the current round of BRIC applications. So as it says in here, it's a high priority for the construction-ready infrastructure, and a lot less interest in doing capacity building, which is not the route we would probably go if we were looking at how to make it ideal for Appalachian communities. But yeah. So Cheyenne looking for experience finding alternate routes to funding resilience without actually using resilience-focused funding. Unless, I don't know if you have any insight into that with your work at Mountain Association. Okay, if you don't, or again, if anyone else on the call does, but I know that y'all at Mountain Association spend a lot of time working with folks on trying to think about all the different approaches to a problem and how those different approaches might attract different potential funding streams. So definitely that approach is exactly the way to solve the problem. But yeah, Les.
Yeah, I don't. It's an interesting question, Cheyenne, and I think that the most ready answer in my mind is with our energy work, and in as much as it's sort of a circular approach to resilience. Our energy team works with businesses, local governments, and nonprofits across Appalachian Kentucky to identify energy efficiency and renewable energy opportunities they may have, and that has been a lot of solar. We are working with some places on some solar with battery storage, things of that nature. And we are a lender. We do finance the solar projects for those entities if they're warranted, and if our energy team says they are of a value to the organization, right? A lot of our work is in sort of validation of that sort of thing, and in making sure that the payback is there, the opportunity is there. It's a real benefit for the person looking for the solar. So in that regard, there's some resilience piece there. But I don't know otherwise off the top of my head. I might have to chew on that a little bit. Central Appalachian Network probably also has better thoughts on that.
Yeah. And we linked to Ken at the start of the chat because we do work with them, but yeah, and I know Mountain Association does as well. They or have a lot of folks thinking about it. So I mean, and some of this is some of the approaches, just to say, so with the App Flood Policy Group, the Appalachian Flood Resilience Coalition, which ReImagine and App Voices and others work closely with, we thought about the issue of flooding in the region, and we teased out some of with a policy focus, these specific platforms with the question of what's, specific, what problems are specific to Appalachia. And I'm always interested in what what are the questions and issues that no one will talk about if we don't, right? What are the things that are kind of unique to Appalachia in that context that may not be seen at the national level? And then how can we figure out what those are and lift those up? And so we looked at those pillars. The reason I bring this up as an answer to your question, Cheyenne, is because we did look a lot about, agricultural land health. We have so much agricultural land, and the healthier that soil is, the more water that soil can absorb. We looked at former mine lands and other, post-industrial lands that aren't absorbing water at the rate that a forest would, or in the same way that a city that has, sewage systems, et cetera, that direct the water to a certain place have. And so when we have those degraded landscapes, you see reduced ability to retain rainfall. And so the answer, so some of those things that are about, kind of land health and those sorts of aspects, they may not be seen always in a flooding context, but at the end of the day, for Appalachia, they are about flooding for us. And so I would just toss that out there as well. We're doing a lot of thinking and our different coalitions about green sinks and nature-based hazard solutions that we can just come up with ways, some of which are relatively inexpensive, to put the water a place where it should be or give it a place to go when it's coming down. And so those are all pieces that we're spending a lot of folks in the region are spending a lot of time thinking about that may not necessarily come. It's not just raising a levee, not just putting in a dam, but thinking about it from those approaches. And so I'll leave it at that. We are at the hour. Thank you everyone so much for your time. Thank you, Anna, for the incredible amount of research you shared with us today. Do any of our speakers have any last thoughts or answers to questions or reflections on anything that they saw in the chat before we leave? All right. So we'll keep it simple. Thank you everyone so much. And like I said, this is part of the series. We'll continue having this conversation. And if you want to be in the conversation with us in between our webinars, be in touch.